Nothing is ever solved in painting. It's a continuous chain that sometimes doesn't go in one line, but goes in a serpentine line or in crooked paths, detours, which have to be investigated.
One of the things that excited me most as we met with the curators was how this show was going to take a look at his social conscience from boyhood and his preoccupation with the horrors of the world and the cruelty of the world and the way in which it entered his work and then comes back into his work in a different form toward the end of his life.
Earlier in his career, in the 30s, he did depictions of Klansmen brutalizing Black people, the conspirators, for example. So it was really interesting to think about the Klansmen in the front of conspirators as Guston meditating on what it means to be deliberate about something as horrific as a hanging. Somebody had to make the rope, make the noose. And that's the strange thing to depict, this deliberateness. But that's what it takes, a kind of deliberateness, There are many ways to kill people. To draw a noose and hang somebody is a very deliberate thing because it's sending a message, Its deliberateness is part of the message.
The abstract painting of the 50s and early 60s that people loved so much really had to do with his wish to have a process of working that was closer to him and more deeply expressive, rather than the more descriptive painting he had done before that.
White painting one, it's an image of something becoming, this unfurling, unspooling. And I think that's why it's such a moving and great painting, because it feels like something coming into being for the first time, like almost watching a flower grow. And you do have this sense that he was also of sort of figuring it out on the fly. I love all the descriptions of when he's making white painting and when he steps back at the end of the day and says, "Where is it?" The funny thing to me about Guston saying, I got sick of all that purity, when he's starting to paint figuratively again. To me, the late paintings seem to be so much about purity because of their directness, and there's something so straightforward and in their simplicity and the way they just talk about everyday life. They seem to me very pure. And just that pure sense of the image, making images and being overwhelmed by the desire to make images, and that, that urgency that one feels of him having to keep up with himself as the images come rushing forth.
Guston's paintings take me there, to the outskirts, to the city limits, where white men in hoods ride around in jalopies, patrolling the borders of sundown towns, as in, better get your black ass out of here before sundown. Guston's shift to these depictions of Klansmen in the late 60s, early 70s is at a moment when he's realizing in, sort of the wake of the civil rights movement, the rise of the Black Power movement, he's realizing that it's not enough to depict Black suffering, that in some ways he has to interrogate the seeds of white supremacy in himself or in the culture. So he decides not to say that the racist people are over there, those Klansmen, but say, no, the racist people are in here. They're in the attitudes that this country has been built on. The Klansman in The Right of Bad Habits is holding a whip kind of behind his back, but it was never clear to me whether that whip has just struck the Klansman in front of him or it's self-flagellation, Guston is funny, too, the giant liquor bottle, in the front of, that takes up so much of the foreground of that painting is kind of absurd and hilarious, and yes, a bad habit. As is being a Klansman, kind of a bad habit, The comedian George Carlin once said, "The reason they call it the American dream is because you have to be asleep to believe in it." Guston's hood paintings, with their ambiguous narratives and incendiary subject matter, are not asleep, they're woke.
The cartoonishness of the late works is what enables us to look at such horrific subjects. And I think that's partly their brilliance too, that how do you talk about such brutality and, how horrific the world is? The absurdity of the language is in a way, I think, what allows him to make these paintings that are very violent, raw. Because you want to look at a cartoon and you want to look at something that's like Pepto-Bismol pink and strawberries, and then before you know it, you're looking at something, a moment of horror.
This was 1971, before Watergate. My father tells a life story that he then calls Poor Richard. He tries to not depict Nixon as the other, but to really sort of get inside what would move a man to become so corrupt and so dark in his ambition. My favorite sequence in this book, actually, is where he is currying favor, and you see him campaigning with older people, with hippies, with the evangelical Christians, law and order. What politicians do, they pander. I mean, talk about what appeals about Guston now, in Philip Guston now, is that he didn't pander. He was almost always out of step with what was expected of him as an artist.
I think it's a very brave move for an artist to give up that thing that one does very well to do this other thing, that he also does very well.
It's the freedom of Guston that I think in the end has made him so influential. Every few years there's a shift, and he kind of outdoes himself. The circling back, the delving into his own imagery and own history, the emergence and re-emergence of forms. I think this is why he's been such an influence on painters in particular.